Hello. In this episode of Airs for Architecture, I spoke with Sofia Singler, Assistant Professor of Architecture at the University of Cambridge, about her recent book, The Religious Architecture of Alvar Aalto and Elisa Aalto, published by Lund Humphreys in 2023.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Dr. Sofia Singler about your new book on the Aaltos. But before we get into the book, Sofia, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Well, thank you, Ambrose. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's a real delight. My name is Sofia Singler, and I come from the city of Jyväskylä in central Finland, but I'm currently based at the University of Cambridge, where I teach architecture.
And you're an architect by training?
Yeah, that's right. Architect and I guess architectural historian, seeing as I've kind of split into architectural history and theory in time.
Where did you train?
I moved to England for my undergraduate straight after high school in Finland, completed my bachelor's degree at Cambridge, and then moved to the United States, where I practiced in Boston and then ended up staying in the States for graduate school. Did my MArch at Yale, and then returned to the UK for round two for my PhD, which I completed also at Cambridge. And I found myself at Cambridge ever since.
You shall never escape. We shall never be free. You've got this beautiful book.
Thank you.
Published by Lund Humphreys last year, wasn't it?
Yes.
The Religious Architecture of Alvar Aalto and Elisa Aalto.
Mm.
There's a lot in just the title that we could talk about, because obviously Alvar Aalto is a totemic figure of the modern movement, a great hero, a fountainhead in some ways of the modernist imagination. But you've combined it here with Aalto and Elisa. So we need to understand that a little bit better. But perhaps to begin, what lies behind the book? Where did it come from? What motivated it?
Well, in very pragmatic terms, it's essentially an extension, or I suppose more accurately, an adaptation of my PhD, which looked at the Aaltos religious architecture, and more specifically the Church of the Three Crosses in Imatra in eastern Finland. But given that this was a book for a more general audience, it's a slightly more expanded version in the sense that it attempts to look at the religious architecture of the Aaltos beyond just that one church building. Although the Church of the Three Crosses, I think it's fair to say, occupies most of the book. I think it's the most illustrative and perhaps the most interesting example of religious projects that they worked on. So it's slightly more expansive, I'd say. But thematically, where it all began, I suppose, is in biographical terms, me growing up in Jyväskylä, which is known as the city of the Aaltos, with the most Aalto projects in the world. So I suppose I knew Aalto before I knew any other kind of architecture. And then I moved to the UK to study architecture at university and realized that he was really quite famous, this guy from my hometown, and that there's a lot of research to do there. In my undergraduate, for my final dissertation, I worked with Nicholas Ray, also from the University of Cambridge. He was my supervisor on an undergraduate thesis on the unrealized funerary projects of Alvar Aalto. I'd somehow learned that many modernists, including, of course, Gunnar Asplund and Sigurd Leverance, had worked on cemeteries and funerary chapels, and I realized that I didn't know of any for Alvar Aalto, or indeed Elisa or Aino either. And so that got me involved in a small project on the funerary architecture of the Aaltos. And then a few years later in graduate school, I took a really pivotal seminar with Professor Carla Britton at the Yale School of Architecture called Religion and Modern Architecture. And that became an opportunity for me to expand on that previous research by looking not just at funerary architectures, but religious architecture more generally, but still keeping to the Aaltos. And from there, you could say it just snowballed. And then it snowballed into a PhD on the sacred architecture of the Aaltos.
It's lovely. That must be a very pleasant thing to sort of find that a local hero is actually an international superstar. But it's kind of a funny idea that what is, I suppose, fairly everyday to the people in your hometown has this kind of presence in the imagination of a global imagination, which is really lovely. But you've obviously, as I said, Alvar Aalto, big figure, big name. But this book isn't just about Alvar Aalto. Who are the other two names? Who are Aino and Alyssa? By the way, my pronunciation of your lovely Finnish name is going to. I even understand now that I pronounce Alto wrong, but whatever.
That's okay. But Finnish does soft dental T's, so it's Aalto rather than Aalto. But in any case, the three of them were co-directors of the eponymous firm, which in the course of its existence actually had several names, but the most commonly used is simply Alvar Aalto Architects Limited, translated directly from the Finnish, Alvar Aalto Arkkitehdit Oy. But yeah, they were three co-directors, and Aino was Alvar Aalto's first wife. She was born in 1894, so she was a few years older than Alvar, and they worked together from the very early years of the practice all the way until 1949, when Aino sadly passed away. And a few years later, in 1952, Alvar then married, who became, well, her name was Elsa Mäkiniemi originally, but then she became Elisa Aalto upon marriage, and that was Alvar's second wife, and then the kind of final co-director of the firm. And after Alvar's death in 1976, Elisa Aalto took control of the firm and spearheaded it solo until 1994, when the firm closed and she died herself.
It's amazing, isn't it? These kind of figures, that they have such close contact to the present. I mean, 1994, I was 15.
Yeah.
And, it's sort of touching distance to these kind of heroic figures. Why is it important to connect these three Aalto figures, particularly as two of them are women, to what has, up until, I guess, fairly recently, been seen as his work? What do you think it brings to the story? And I suppose more interestingly, because I guess I can predict that answer, but more interestingly, what was their influence in the work? What was the relationship of them to the design work itself of the Aaltos?
Well, I think speaking of the Aaltos in plural as the Aaltos, or indeed in the singular, but rather than specifying a specific name and using the term Studio Aalto instead, testifies to the, I guess, intimately and inextricably collaborative nature of the practice. This is a practice where it wasn't common to sign individual drawings, because it was understood that this is collaborative, collective work, and we're all invested in the same project, in the same design language, the same problems. And I think that using the Aaltos, or Studio Aalto as the preferred term, testifies to that ethos, you could say, a certain sociocultural milieu, encompassing both the physical place, Studio Aalto, in Munkkiniemi in Helsinki, designed by themselves for themselves as the place of work and thought. And also the firm understood as a collective of collaborators. People came and went, of course. There were hundreds of employees in the course of several decades of practice. This is a firm that operated from the 1920s until the 1990s, and a lot happened in those 70 years. But I think really it's just an attempt to say that this is collaborative work in the shorthand. And when it comes to the religious projects in particular, you could say that Aino Aalto was involved primarily in the unrealized schemes of the 1920s and 30s. So she and Alvar submitted various co-authored proposals to competitions for Finnish churches, especially in central Finland. They also worked on some renovation schemes for older 18th and 19th century churches locally in their area. Whereas Elisa Aalto was involved in the later career works, and particularly the realized churches that we still have standing today. And if my book looks at the religious architecture of this firm, then it's natural, I think, to credit all three of them, because they all worked on these projects together.
That's a very elegant answer. I like this idea of what you call the collaborative and collective work, and then you use words ethos and milieu. And I guess we can kind of come back to that. but it's a point you make at the very start of your book, and I think it's sort of the elephant in the room in a way, which is that this modernist period, this modernizing period of architecture is not necessarily connected with religious work. Modernity and secularization. I think it's Peter Berger talks about secularization as being one of the 5 sort of key aspects of modernization. So it's kind of interesting that we would even talk about this rather than sort of, I guess, more worthy or serious subjects. But how do the Aaltos square this in their own work? How are they engaging with it? What does it mean? And I suppose religiously, who are they? What is their spiritual orientation? Is this a significant part of what they want to be as architects?
Well, to give a slightly polemical answer, I would probably say, rhetorically, who cares? Or why would we need to care only about their own spiritual orientation? And this was a big problem for me undertaking my research and then writing the book. And this speaks to, I think, a longstanding, a persistent problem, you could say, in the historiography of modern architecture, where, as you've outlined, we still tend to understand and define processes of modernization as industrialization, mechanization, rationalization, and indeed secularization. And so, in essence, in most understandings, most definitions, modernity as a condition, as an existential state of being, implies secularism as well. And of course, it shows in the history and the historiography of modern architecture, where I guess you could say caricaturing and simplifying somewhat, but by and large, religious commissions aren't really seen as properly modern architecture. They're something that modernists might engage with on the side, sometimes purely for financial benefit, perhaps for boredom, or where they're discussed in more detail, the classic examples being, of course, Le Corbusier and Ronchamp. There's a sense that these are influential one-offs and that somehow the character is what matters. It's here comes Le Corbusier with his amazing Orphic, esoteric, Catholic, mystic, alchemical references that he as a genius figure combines and melds together into this wonderful masterpiece that we now know as Ronchamp. Mm-hmm. And I'd say that there's relatively little in the middle. And so that's the foundational premise or problem, I suppose, of the historiography of religious buildings within modern architecture. And when we get to the Aaltos, it's neither nor. I would kind of place their religious oeuvre somewhere in the middle, I suppose, where they weren't incidental projects that they didn't really care for. They weren't just bread and butter projects that needed to be completed for financial gain, nor were they deep expressions of their own religious and theological views. They truly were perhaps a bit of both. But the longstanding assumption in all the scholarship was always that the churches are interesting, very stirring experiments spatially and structurally. And this goes back to Alvar Aalto's biographer, Göran Schild, as well as many others, of course, but Schild, I suppose, occupies a really important position in Aalto scholarship in general. And it's his claims that Aalto was not religious that were subsequently echoed and repeated by various others, which started to create this impression that, okay, if Alvar Aalto himself wasn't particularly religious, he must have taken these projects on purely opportunistically. These were interesting side projects through which he could experiment with interesting solutions and construction space and form, but he had no personal, ethical, theological, or religious investment in them. They were purely opportunistic, artistic experiments to work on the side and perhaps come up with an interesting skylight or detailing solution that then he could adapt to a more important or ostensibly important civic or residential context. And it was this problem that I wanted to tackle. Some of it, I guess, intuitively felt a little too straightforward, a narrative. And I had this budding realization or hypothesis, I suppose you could say from the beginning, that this was a narrative that didn't entirely take into account the sociocultural quality of Finland as a place, and as a country, as a nation state, as a culture. Finland, even today, along with the other Nordic countries, is in practice among the most secular countries in the world. If you look at, polls on people's personal religious views and so on. Yet the majority of the population to this day belongs to the Finnish National Church. It's not a state church, so the president does not occupy a formal role in the church, unlike here in the UK, where King Charles, of course, is also head of the church. But it's a national church, and so it means that they're still intimately intertwined in many ways. And it creates what you could call a kind of baseline Lutheran culture, where Lutheranism affects every single aspect of life, from the Nordic welfare state to the church's own approach to art and architecture, to the importance of Finnish literature and language, coming from Lutheran ideas of the vernacular being more important than Latin, and so on and so forth. And it was that context that I think defines much of the Aaltos religious oeuvre, in which I wanted to investigate in my own work as well.
Well, that is a very, very thorough and clear answer, which I really appreciate. I suppose I ask that question, and in a way you've sort of addressed it in a manner. I asked the question about their own religious orientation, and I like this idea of having an embedded sort of deep cultural Lutheranism that possibly parallels the deep cultural Anglicanism of Britain, which is far deeper than the superficial practice of it. You even get people like Richard Dawkins these days, renowned atheist, saying, culturally, he rather likes Christianity. It's sort of right down there. And perhaps our own welfare state depends on that identity.
Yeah, I think you're right. They're certainly interlinked, that there's a lot of affinities between the two in that respect, for sure. And if we really want to go back to your initial question and say, what were these three, all those personal religious views? Well, the honest answer is we don't know. How could we know? How are we to x-ray their minds and figure out their theological positions? We can't know. And I'm not convinced that it should matter that much necessarily. I think there's this persistent idea somehow that lingers, I'd say particularly when it comes to religious architecture, that we somehow must try and build a bridge or find a connection between the author's personal views and the subsequent building. Why?
Because we do it with everything else. We like to see the connection between Mozart's vivacity and his lifestyle. We believe that art is always subjective. I mean, this has been narrativized forever. I mean, I personally am ambivalent about that idea. I personally think it's possible for artists to create things out with themselves, just as it's possible for a scientist to create experiments that exist beyond themselves, that obviously have their origins in the imagination, the design thinking of those people. But I guess my question more is working, so to go back to the Aaltos, working more at that incredible moment at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th, and then through the middle of the emancipating moments of the post-war years. Religion is also going through, institutional religion is also going through an incredible transformation in the Catholic Church through things like the liturgical movement and the work of Pius X and Leo XIII, and then obviously in the Second Vatican Council. And Robert Proctor's book on that documents in the Catholic world in Britain that transformation, and how the architect's own relationship to the institutional religious bodies was significant in the design of buildings. And I was just wondering, did the Aaltos sit close to that kind of radicalizing agenda? Were they part of that kind of surge towards emancipation, the kind of emancipation of Christian thinking?
In fact, I'd say the opposite, based on my research. So again, I'm not able to assign clear-cut religious or theological views to any three of them.
No.
But what's emerged throughout the research is that they're in intimate dialogue and contact with various church officials, all the way from local parish priests and other employees, all the way to the top, you could say, of the church institution when it comes to the National Church of Finland, to the highest bishops and ultimately archbishop of the church as well. And I'd argue that the kinds of religious meanings or perhaps even messages that we might read into or read from the subsequent designs are the products of a certain kind of push and pull between their own intuitive positions and the renewalist ethos and programs set out by the church. Alvar Aalto in particular, in my research, emerges as a figure who's actually quite conservative, you could say, when it comes to this impulsive liberation or emancipation, as you call it, referring both to liturgical renewal and the Second Vatican Council, as well as the emergence of new religious building types in the 20th century, particularly the parish center. Mm-hmm. As we know, after the Second World War, there's the sense that the church needs to embed itself into the everyday life of citizens. The idea is that the horrors, the existential horrors of the war have shown that there's still a need for a message of faith and hope. And so the church is needed, but that it's seen as an ostentatious institution, and that its architecture in most instances seems to mirror that degree of ostentatiousness and being somehow quite divorced from the everyday worries of the people. And so we get the liturgical renewal movement, a sense of really quite literally bringing the church closer to the people, bringing the altar closer to the people, changing around the officiating clergy to face the people rather than face the altar, and so on. And the same impulse, you could say, led to the popularity of the parish center as a building type. That in this age of austerity and post-war horror, we don't need to build big and fancy buildings anymore, but it's okay to, and indeed even desirable, to build humble buildings that somehow seek to reflect the humbleness of the institution and its ethos of being part of everyday life with the people. This all sounds well and good, of course, but my sense is that Alvar Aalto in particular wasn't really convinced by that. He didn't buy that. And although he may not have been traditionally religious, he certainly wasn't publicly religious. He wasn't outspoken about his theological views. But my sense is that he really valued religion, and not just Lutheranism in Finland, but religion in general, and specifically Christianity, as part of an unchanging European cultural tradition. And the attraction, the appeal, the value, the beauty of religion and Christianity in particular for him was that the message was always the same. And I suppose for that reason, the idea of renewing things and shaking things up and coming up with a new liturgy and a new building type felt a bit too radical for him, which is really interesting, given that, of course, he was quite radical himself as a designer. You know, he set up Artek together with collaborators in the mid-1930s. He was invested in figuring out a completely new type of modern architecture that took ingredients from international style, so-called orthodox modern architecture, you could say, but then blended it with ingredients from the Finnish vernacular and a whole range of eclectic sources. So it's not to say that he's a timid character and that he opposes change in general. Quite the opposite. There are these heroic spearheading qualities to the rest of his portfolio, but when it comes to religious projects, I think there was a degree of perhaps nervousness, a degree of not quite wanting to jump on the bandwagon too easily, out of a fear that perhaps these changes were too much and that they risked losing some of the cultural value of religion, or religion as the Aaltos themselves saw it.
It's interesting. There are parallels, I suppose, in the Catholic Church with the loss of the Latin Mass and the resistance by secular figures to that. I mean, the famous, it's called the Agatha Christie indult. Agatha Christie herself was not a Catholic, but she was one of the signatories alongside people like I think Yehudi Menuhin, who's obviously not Catholic as well, and many others, figures from public life who wrote to the Pope to say, could you please allow the continuation of the Latin Mass, because it's a cultural form which has value in and of itself. And I wonder if there's something in it of that.
Yeah, and I mean, I should add there, if I may, that it's not just the Aaltos, and in fact, it's many other architects in Finland as well that are equally skeptical of the church's self-diagnosed and self-determined need to update itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting. There's even a conference that's organized in the 1950s, jointly by the Finnish National Church and the Finnish Association of Architects, on the problem of the parish center as a new building type. And what emerges from that conference is that architects as figures come across as much more conservative than men of the church. You have priests and clergy saying, we have to do this and it's time to update. We have to come closer to people. We have to, in essence, desacralize much of church architecture. We've been too focused on a sense of the sacred, and we must now turn our attention to the everyday concerns of the people. And architects are the figures to say, maybe not. Maybe we're about to lose something. And maybe a sense of hierarchy, maybe a sense of difference between the sacred and the profane, or between jubilation and the everyday. Maybe those are necessary. Maybe they make for a good life and indeed a good city or a good kind of architecture. And so Aalto wasn't alone in that.
I want to come back into that idea of the good city and the way that religious architecture is utilized or leveraged around that. But before, I think you've mentioned this parish centre. And obviously in your book, you document the 10 major churches, full-scale churches that the Aaltos built. And it starts
7 realized churches.
Seven realized, okay. And we start off in 1926 to 9 with the Church of Muurame. Yeah. Muurame. And this is a sort of classical style church. The next one you document, the Church of the Three Crosses at Imatra from 1955, so 30 years later, radically different. So the typology has shifted, and we've got this idea of a new form of church. You've mentioned the parish centre. Could you explain a little bit about what this typological shift physically means, and perhaps a little bit about the function and use of these buildings and the way that they're kind of positioned, I suppose, urbanly?
So firstly, just to give an overview of the religious portfolio in bigger picture terms, as you've just outlined, the 1920s and 30s were a very active time for Alvar and Aino Aalto. These are the decades in which they took part in several church competitions in Finland. They worked on church renovation and reconstruction schemes as well. They weren't always that successful, but if you look at their competition proposals, you can see a stylistic and indeed kind of typological architectural evolution occurring in those drawings as well. They very famously went to Tuscany on their honeymoon in 1924, were hugely impressed and enamored by what they saw, and essentially adapted what they had seen in Tuscany to the hills of central Finland. And this is where you get really quite directly classical buildings in their portfolio in the early years. The Church of Muurame in the late 20s is what the Aaltos themselves called a kind of hybrid form project, which started off as decidedly classical in tenor, but in the course of the few years that it was on the drawing board, morphed into something somewhat functionalist in tenor by the end. So it's a kind of half-half hybrid. There's a wonderful story of Alvar Aalto himself, tongue-in-cheek as usual, but nonetheless calling the building a sin of his youth, perhaps referring to the slightly awkward stylistic hybrid that it ended up as.
Well, it's kind of like pre-postmodern, isn't it?
I guess you could say that. So, some ingredients are there for sure. And although many of his ecclesiastical architectural ambitions, you could say, came to fruition in that building, most importantly, this sense of the church on the hill, which he'd loved in Italy, that the church is something you see from afar. He managed to express the stream in this design, I'm not sure that he was entirely convinced by the rest of it. There's a degree of self-criticality in there as well. But the competition submissions continued, and then they morphed after the Church of Morome into something increasingly and boldly, heroically functionalist in tenor. But there was no success for the Aaltos. They chronically losed all the church competitions they took part in. And we don't know why. Perhaps it is that chronic sense of failure. Perhaps it's something else. Perhaps more positively, it's being distracted by major other projects. Their own home in Helsinki, the pavilions for the World's Fair in New York and Paris, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, after the 30s, what follows is a kind of intermission, as I call it in my book, during which the Aaltos and the firm designed no religious projects whatsoever. And it's only in the 50s that they pick up again. So just after the death of Aino Aalto, Alvar Aalto returns to religious projects. He takes part, for instance, in a competition for a cemetery and funerary chapels and crematoria in Denmark. And indeed, after that, is commissioned for the Church of the Three Crosses in Imatra in eastern Finland, which, as you say, is the first post-Muurame realized church building, and which then opens up this portfolio of realized post-war churches. 3 of which are in Finland, 2 of which are in Wolfsburg in Germany, and 1 of which is in Italy, in Riola, just outside Bologna, and which represents the only Catholic exception to an otherwise Lutheran group of commissions.
So the Church of the Three Crosses, this is the one where this new parish centre plus church typology is utilised. And the parish centre is a social centre that delivers the kind of social teachings of Lutheranism to the world, or what does it do?
Yeah, exactly. It's a kind of half religious, half secular building type that seeks to serve the local parish and the local community. But in addition to the Mass and the religious service and prayer as its prime functions, it also adds in spaces like club rooms or teaching halls, cafeterias, often sports fields as well. It's an attempt to be a kind of community building that can then also be used for church services at the same time. And this had become very popular in the 50s in the post-war context in Finland, as indeed elsewhere. So in this point in time, the Protestant church really mirrored the developments of the Roman Catholic Church quite directly. And what's really interesting about the Church of the Three Crosses is that it was an exception in the Aaltos church portfolio in the sense that it was a direct commission rather than a competition product. And so they had full liberty to design what they wanted, as it were. But nonetheless, the local parish were very insistent that this building become a parish center. Now is the time. The new town of Imatra, which was formed after territorial reorganization in eastern Finland following the Second World War, this was a new town that already had 2 existing churches, not particularly interesting architecturally, but nonetheless, they were qualified as old school proper churches. And so the sensibility, you can say, from the parish's point of view was, great, now it's time for us to have a parish center so we can prove our modernity and show that we are en vogue. And the Aaltos didn't like that. They somehow again felt that was an attack against the necessary and due sacrality of a religious building. And rather than reject the commission, rather than getting into an outright fight with the local parish priests and say, we're going to do a big church, whether you like it or not, what followed is a period of discourse and debate, kind of dialectical process of engaging with the parish, wherein I argue in the book as well, the end product is something more of a hybrid. And so what happened is, rather than having either a parish center or what we might call an old school church, for lack of a better term, the end result is a mixture, a rather ambiguous mixture of both. And what Aalto did, and I learned this from church meeting minutes and correspondence, is he very cleverly exploited the biblical metaphor of a heavenly forecourt to make this happen. And so the end result, the Church of the Three Crosses typologically, it has this old school church, a very grand nave that's set out into three sectors, beautiful vaults and billowing curved walls, a longitudinal plan, a very strong, unusually strong hierarchy, you could say, given what was going on in church architecture in Finland at the time, a due sense of sacrality in a very Aalto-esque way. But then attached to that, laterally, you have a smaller kind of subsidiary volume, if you will, that houses the foyer and downstairs spaces for eating and socializing and club spaces. So in essence, you have a kind of dual volume block that has the church proper and then an adaptation of what the parish center could have looked like. And the way Aalto managed to convince the parish to do this was to call the subsidiary block the heavenly forecourt. And he said, this is how it was done in Jerusalem. After all, you have the temple proper and you have the forecourt right in front of it as an intermediary space. And this is what I'm doing here. And this is the bit that serves the social functions that you're asking me to include in this brief.
There's something very monastic about it, and also of the cross of the plains as well, isn't there? There's something almost medieval, like this re-engagement with institutional religion. And you see this in Corb's work as well. This re-engagement with religion is on the terms of something that was definitively not Victorian, sort of jumping back pre-modern in a way.
Yeah, and these medievalist reverberations in modernism are of course, quite commonplace in the work of many, many modernists. Right, this common sense that what modernists were doing was often rejecting a recent past rather than history at large. And at times that meant returning to ancient origins and at times to medieval histories instead. And for sure, this is something that happened in religious architecture quite widely, including in Aalto's portfolio. When it comes to the Church of the Three Crosses, I'd say a particular medieval strand, if you will, in the design was its construction. It's famous, and I should say infamous, for having more than 100 windows, none of which are the same. And so building it was quite the process. And you can see medievalist reverberations in the fact that the studio had to work with local window makers, local carpenters to make this building a reality. And that's an example that might be qualified in somewhat medievalist terms, where the church is a kind of love of labor, in which various people, dozens and dozens of people, if not hundreds of people, participate collectively.
But that comes to this idea, which I suppose one picks up about Aalto more than other high modernists, which is, to jump forward a bit, that Frampton picks up on in his idea of Aalto as a critical regionalist, as a postmodern sort of architect. This idea of materials and the connection of materialness to craftedness, and therefore the presence of the builder as craftsman within that. And I wonder whether, going back to something you said earlier about the architects being somewhat resistant to this modernizing tendency within institutional Christianity in the West at that time, was that modernism or modernity as such was seen as being too homogeneous, too indifferent to local custom. And by designing in these kinds of ways, the Aaltos ensured a mode of production which necessarily embedded the building in the culture of Finland. So even though it looked modern, even though it kind of adopted certain modern tropes and motifs, that aesthetics of austerity is the way I often think about it, blank walls, simple design and so on. Even though those things were adopted, what happens is that craftedness, the 100 different shaped windows, ensures that it is always at its heart finish. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say so. And I'm inclined to believe the Aaltos would say so themselves. I guess many modernists would say what you describe as an aesthetics of austerity would actually be an aesthetics of timelessness. but then that could be complemented by references to an ancient past or the vernacular. And indeed, that's why we sometimes look at the work, in particular of Aino and Alvar Aalto, so the earlier decades of the portfolio, as a kind of forest modernism or vernacular modernism, which seeks consciously to combine a kind of international style orthodoxy with ingredients of craft and vernacular building tradition, which is inherently Finnic in character. And some of that lives on in the churches, 100%. But at the same time, what's really interesting about the interiors in particular, and if you look at the naves, is they're all white. In a way that's the kind of classic modernist trope. And that's what lives on in their church interiors. So a lot of the detailing is crafted in a very Aaltoesque manner, but there's something inherently modernist at the same time. So their medievalism or their interest in craft and the vernacular doesn't result in these highly shadowy, murky crafted church interiors like you might associate with Sigurd Leverens in Sweden. But these are bright, white, light naves.
Yeah, I often think about that the adoption or the preference within modernist church design for the basilica rather than the cruciform church as a way of generating a physical participation in the liturgy. And I've thought about this idea of participation quite a lot. There's a kind of absurdity at the heart, which insists that participation is only that which is active, and all other forms of participation don't count, like mental or, dare I say it, spiritual participation. And so the basilica enables that because it's clear sight lines, no one can hide away. You can't get an old lady lighting candles in the corner muttering her rosary to herself, because that would somehow be problematic. I don't know, whatever. But I do wonder also if there's a connection to the basilica with its origins in the Roman temple, that there's a kind of pagan form being adopted here as well, which I've often wondered whether that was a kind of subtle modernist critique, challenge.
Yeah, I'd say 100%. I mean, everything you said, yes, I agree with. And I'd say this perception of the basilica being a particularly participatory typology, well, someone like Aldo would have thought of the basilica as one that allows for slightly murkier edges toward the back of the space, kind of the pews of the doubting Thomases in the congregation, where you see everything that's going on and you're involved by virtue of existing in the space and having the clear sight lines, as you suggest, but being slightly removed from it. So it's important to have that distance, and you can only have that distance in a longitudinal plan, which is why he's so insistent on keeping to the basilica form, even if he does fan them out. So all those post-war churches are all fanned in shape. It's not a clear rectangular basilical form, but it's longitudinal, and the plan always widens away from the altar. So it creates a very strong visuospatial hierarchy in which your attention is drawn immediately to the cross at the end, at the altar, and then allows for a kind of less focused, less intense experience toward the back of the church. And I like to think of those as the pews of the skeptics, with whom I think Alvar Aalto in particular identified himself. But yes, I think it's also a question, as you say, of acknowledging quite explicitly the history of the building type itself. And this is an idea that would have appealed to the Aaltos and indeed many of their peers, to seek timelessness through an understanding of various periods in history in a sense of certain recurrences and adaptations, wherein the basilica is both Christian and pagan Roman at the same time. I think for them that would have been a wonderfully beautiful idea, and it would have been a shame to let go of that.
I wanted to ask a little bit about this idea of the church's exterior and aesthetic a bit more. As I understand it, there's close cooperation between, in these post-war years, between state agencies, planning, urban renewal, and social renewal after the Second World War, and the church organizations, church bodies, who are in a way invited into these new and renewed cities to set up parishes, and often enough in Britain, I don't know about Finland, but in Britain set up schools as well, and so on and so forth. And so the church buildings have this kind of, they operate as significant incidents in the urban plan. They have an urban identity, which they then have to, I suppose, attain, they have to work towards. And I'm kind of interested in how the Aaltos engaged with that, because in your book, you describe, as I read it, you describe the way that their buildings, and the way that, in a way that their buildings are instruments of democratization. And I suppose that goes back to this idea of the Basilican plan and the way that they used the splayed Basilican plan, for example, which is a sort of an interior democratization of sacred space. How do the churches work externally as moments in the city?
Well, if we begin in the early decades of the portfolio, again, Aino and Alvar were enamored by Italian precedents and this tradition of the campanile, the bell tower, announcing the presence of a church far afield, the church occupying a really majestic spot in any given village, town, or city. And that's something they sought to emulate quite directly in their own work. And this tradition, specifically in Finland, existed as well. We call it kirkko keskellä kylää, so that literally translates to the church in the middle of the town. So the church becomes the literal and metaphorical center point of any given settlement. It's a very, very established tradition. And in some ways, given their ideas of the importance of religion as a set of unchanging customs and principles, a really valuable dimension of cultural heritage, this is something I think they were very keen to promote and propagate in their own portfolio. Things, however, got a little complicated post-war with the redesign of new city centers, or the reurbanization of previous city centers, where many modernists were working with rather rationalist plans of redensifying the city center after previous decades' experiments with decentralization and kind of car-based society. The sense that now we're ready to redensify and we're ready to recongregate all of the constituent functions of the city back in the city center, spanning everything from banks to shopping centers to town halls to libraries to churches. Interestingly, I'd say the Aaltos were skeptical of the churches being included in that mix, because they felt that these building types were being homogenized too much, and that the church risked being desacralized by virtue of becoming one Tetris block amongst all others. Here's a bank, and here's an art gallery, and here's a bus terminus, and by the way, here's a chapel as well. And for that reason, their understanding of and their relationship to urban paradigms within religious modern architecture was rather contentious. And what they sought to do, to the extent that they managed to, such as at the Church of the Three Crosses in Imatra, is to remove the church from the city center. It's a very poignant statement on the fact that, again, perhaps we need a degree of hierarchy where the sacred is set apart from the everyday and the hustle and bustle of the commercial nucleus of the city. And when it came to the Church of the Three Crosses, they were able to do this because this was a direct commission. There's a very generous patron, the director of the local forestry company, who said, I'll donate the plot to you gratis. Off you go and choose one. And so they were able to make a statement quite clearly. In other instances, such as the Church of the Cross in Lahti, which is a very late career church, or indeed the Church of, or the Cross of the Plains in Seinäjoki, the site was predetermined because these were both competition submissions. And then the exercise became, instead of devising an architecture that was somehow physically situated in the heart of the city, but that could somehow announce or establish a due degree of difference to its immediate surroundings. And in my book, I contrast their work with planning, or at the intersection of planning and religious architecture, with the work of peers like Sven Markelius in Sweden, famous for his ABC town vision. ABC being an acronym for Arbete, Bostad och Centrum, so work, living / apartment, and work, where that's the constituent recipe for a good city center, and you mash up all these functions in the nucleus of your new plan, and voila, that the city is ready. People like Sven Markelius would just indicate a plot for a church in this nucleus as well. Vällingby in Stockholm being a good example of that. And that's something that the Aaltos decidedly choose not to do themselves.
It's very fascinating. So their churches retain that kind of, as you say, that sacred presence, not least as you point out, with this idea of creating a forecourt, a heavenly forecourt, protecting themselves from the amorphousness, I suppose, of modern urbanization.
Yeah, they certainly try to. And even in the Church of the Crosses in Imatra, what's really striking is that Alvar Aalto Associates of Studio Aalto as a firm was commissioned to draw up the master plan for Imatra, the whole region, in fact. It's a massive planning project. And more specifically, to draw up plans for the new city center of Imatra as a kind of smaller scale master plan. And in that vision of a new city center, they included a library, a town hall, a museum, a transport terminus organized around a somewhat Italianate piazza, given Alvar Aalto's enduring love of Italy. But again, the church was not there. And despite the fact that they had the liberty to choose wherever in the region to place that church, they didn't put it in their own master plan for the city center, but instead chose a relatively far away plot that was closer to industrial lands and to residential lands and to a bit of forest. And I think that's a very conscious and very significant decision for them to have made.
I asked in my questions that I wrote to you yesterday, for which very, very little lead time on these things. But that is partly intentional, by the way. The longer I give you to think about them, the more you'll think about them, and then
you'll be pleased to hear I didn't have time to read the questions.
I have a feeling that no one ever reads the question. Anyway, whatever. I had asked in the last one, which was, to what extent does the Aalto's sacred works, religious work, inflect their other work? But I think a more pertinent question, perhaps a more interesting question, is how does it affect other architects elsewhere in the world? Is their work leading the way in terms of this reorientation of institutional Christianity during the mid and the post-war years? Is their work leading the way as they explore new typologies, as they explore the aesthetics of a kind of civic religious modernism? And where has this influence gone, do you think? Where has it led to?
I'd say the Aalto's impact or influence globally is tremendous. I mean, it's not uncommon to hear even today of all kinds of practicing architects, both globally famous and lesser known, cite the Aaltos as a paradigm of fantastic architecture, simply put. And so they're renowned for good reason for their detailing, for their interiors, for an impeccable sense of scale and a kind of respect for and admiration for a real understanding of material and tectonics and so on and so forth. And so in residential portfolios, indeed also in civic portfolios, I guess you could detect rather a lot of influence in all kinds of places in the world. But if we tailor the question specifically to address religious architecture, I'm not sure. I know in Finland, there were modernists who were inspired by the Aalto's middle ground approach, I suppose you could say, wherein you take on some elements of renewalist impulses, but you combine them with tradition. And it's not to say, again, that the Aaltos were the first or the only ones to do it, but quite the opposite, that they, in a way, they're part of a bigger family of various other modernists doing the same thing. They're kind of aligned. It's a united front almost of architects versus clergy in some manners. But when it comes to their churches, very specifically architecturally influencing other designers of churches beyond the Nordics in particular, I'm not sure. I'm
just thinking about the work of Gillespie Kidd and Coyer in Scotland, particularly their Church of St. Paul's at Glenrothes, which has good parallels to the, as I see it, it's a smaller version, but clearly is inspired by the Church of Three Crosses. And yeah, as you say, the influences of the Aaltos is incredible in terms of their whole body of work. But I am kind of intrigued by this particular deportment in relation to to religion. But I suppose what it is this democratic impulse, which you seem to suggest inflects a lot of the way that they're thinking about work, not using, I suppose, modernist architecture as an instrument to batter the public with a new philosophy, but rather to enhance and leaven a new society.
I think so, yeah. And what's important is that it's not a transactional impulse, and it's not even a unidirectional impulse of improving necessarily, as much as providing an architecture, a space in which to question. And I think that was a really important impulse in their religious architecture in particular. So if we compare kind of seminal projects, more civic in nature, Saunetson Town Hall, very famously, or the Finnish National Pensions Institute, even the workers' housing in Sunila, these are all projects of the welfare state. And I guess you can read these ambitions of improving and bettering everyday life, improving society, building up a modern Nordic welfare society very directly into these projects. I think that impulse is slightly different in the religious projects because, as noted earlier, they don't take on renewalist paradigms. It's not about improving the church institution. It's not about moving forward and being decidedly modern, as much as saying, let's take a bit of a pause here and let's position ourselves somewhere in the interstice between tradition and modernity. And let's not force on a particular theological view, as much as try and construct spaces for questioning and perhaps even for doubt. And I think that's the fundamental ethos of these churches' architecture.
A perfect point to finish on. Dr. Sofia Singler, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Ambrose. It was a pleasure.
Now deep in chairs in front of the great fire, we grip our hearts and cannot entertain book, thought, or each other. We watch the fire blazing and feel the roots of the house move, but sit on, seeing the window tremble to come in, hearing the stones cry out under the horizons. That's Ted Hughes's poem Wind, and it speaks to me, I suppose, of some of that lovely materiality that Sofia spoke about with the Aaltos. Thanks to her for taking the time to speak with me, and to Lund Humphreys for the lovely PDF of the book. Both Sofia and the book are linked in the podcast description as ever. Thanks for listening.